Mic check 1 2 1 2. Mic check 1 2 1 2. Okay, here we go. Welcome to the pilot of A Yin Yoga podcast. In episode 1 coming up, I will introduce myself in a longer format, kind of like I'm interviewing myself the way I would a guest, which should prove interesting. But if we haven't met yet, I'm your host, Nyk Danu. I am a yoga therapist, a Yin Yoga teacher trainer, a yoga business mentor, and I also teach public yoga classes. So that's me in brief. But I wanted this pilot, this episode before episode 1, to just be a little, hey, here's the podcast. Here's what you can expect here. These are also available on video, so if you would prefer to watch rather than listen, you can check the show notes for a link for that. So why another yoga podcast? This is the question I asked myself for just over 2 years before starting this. But let's rewind a little bit. I started listening to yoga podcasts at a time in my life when I was feeling very disconnected from the yoga world. I had just moved from Calgary, Alberta, which is in Canada, where I was born and raised, to the magical city of Victoria on enchanted Vancouver Island, which is just off the west coast of Canada. At the time, I had been teaching for 13 years. And I moved here in part to go back to school full-time and study Chinese medicine. Since I wasn't yet teaching here, I was feeling very disconnected from yoga and from the yoga world. Not being able to share my enthusiasm and love for yoga, and in particular Yin Yoga, with students on a regular basis really started to leave a little hole in my heart. I was feeling a bit lost and disconnected, a little bit alone in the yogaverse, you could say. And it was at that time that I stumbled across a yoga podcast called Jay Brown's Yoga Talks. Shout out to Jay Brown. So I started listening to that regularly. And then quickly after that, I discovered another yoga podcast called MBOM, which is hosted by my friend, Amanda Kingsmith. Shout out to Amanda. And I've been on her podcast several times. So as I started listening to these two podcasts regularly, they were a bit of a lifeline for me in a time that I was kind of grieving a little bit. Previous to moving to go back to school, I had been teaching yoga full time for many, many years. At the time I moved here, I believe it was 13 or 14 years, something like that, maybe even 15. And so I was really missing my former livelihood and the connection with my students and being able to share this gift of yoga. I was grieving a little bit, feeling quite lost actually, without having yoga to teach. And so these yoga podcasts helped me feel like, even though I wasn't teaching yet in my home city, although it didn't take that long, but in the beginning, I was still connected to yoga and other yoga teachers. And that began my love of podcasts. And I still love me a yoga podcast. And there are a lot of yoga podcasts now, and several really good ones. So then the question becomes again, then why start another yoga podcast? I feel like this podcast will fill a hole. You see, although there's a lot of yoga podcasts out there, at the time of me dreaming this up, I didn't see any yin specific podcasts. Other styles of yoga have podcasts that are devoted specifically to that style of yoga. For example, I know there's several Ashtanga podcasts or Kundalini podcasts. There are podcasts that are yoga related that are quite niched, but I couldn't find any of those for people like me that were total yin yoga geeks. And so I decided to create it because I love geeking out with other people who are also in love with yin yoga. I love learning and studying and growing And there's so much under the Yin Yoga umbrella that can be discussed. So that's what we'll do here on this podcast. There will be solo episodes and longer format interviews with other Yin Yoga teachers, as well as experts in their area of expertise, like anatomy, traditional Chinese medicine, including meridian or channel theory, the elements, Taoist philosophy, meditation, teaching tips, and a whole bunch more. My intention for this podcast is for it to feel like you are sitting down with me having tea. And when we have a guest, like there's a couple of yoga teachers sitting around the kitchen table with you, having some tea and chewing the fat. So you can expect these episodes to be lo-fi, uncensored, and unfiltered. And this is a conscious choice on my part. I think we have far too much polish and filter in our world in general. And of course, the yoga world has fallen prey to that as well. I personally tend to be a bit informal and delightfully imperfect. And so these episodes will be as well. You can also expect adult conversations and adult language. In this podcast, when I interview people, they will be sharing their pre-yoga story, their yoga origin stories, how they found yoga, where they have come from, how they came to yoga, and where they're at now. And sometimes in those stories, there can be sensitive and intense subject matter. So please know that if you're currently healing your trauma and you're going to find conversations where people might be discussing their trauma too much for you right now, then you can check the show notes for content warnings. If you're looking for some real, honest, heartfelt conversations, plenty of Yin Yoga education, and a place to geek out about all things Yin Yoga, then you are in the right place. Welcome to the Yin side. I would be so grateful if wherever you're listening to this right now, you would click the little plus or subscribe or follow wherever you listen to your podcasts. This boosts the podcast up so that other Yin Yoga lovers can find it. And if you're watching this on YouTube, please subscribe and like this video. Okay, I think that's all for now. Let's do this, shall we? I'll talk to you in the next episode. All right, that's a wrap.